Agenda Piece is taking the community by storm, with virtually every content creator and community member riding the wave of the agenda building hype. With this aspect of the community growing to such a large degree, I want to dive into what exactly Agenda Piece really is. What importance does it play to the actual story, how it has impacted the One Piece community, and how great of an effect has it had on the reading comprehension of the One Piece fandom. This is a video I know that we're going to be going back and forth on, and it's actually one I've been planning for a good while now, so I'm begging y'all, just stick around to the end of the video so we know exactly what it is that we're talking about. If you've been watching a few of the videos and been rocking with the content I produce, just take a look down and make sure you're subscribed. I only chef up the most delectable meals over here, and the discussions, while heated, are wonderful, so make sure you join and you're a part of this community. So without further ado, let's dive in as I explain Agenda Piece. Agenda Piece as a concept is more or less betting on certain characters in the story and their future importance or projected strength going forward. The rise of Agenda Piece isn't something that has any concrete start date, with agendas technically existing in the One Piece community since Dressrosa. However, there is definitely an insurgent point with agendas, and that is seen most clearly during the Wano arc. If you didn't know about agendas before, you definitely knew about them during Wano, and that's for a few key reasons, one of which is the change of direction for animation in the One Piece anime. Before I get too deep into that, let's go over why it is that Agenda Piece boomed so hard to begin with in the last 4 to 5 years of the story. For those of us who have been in the Agenda Piece trenches for a while, we know that its rise and sustained growth can largely be attributed to one man, and that's the creator, JD Legend. Jay is the face of the Agenda Piece community for the most part, and most agenda discourse and trajectory is largely based on him and the rats in his community. While Jay is the big cheese in the rat community, others like Cole, Brago, Murphy, Tekking, and others have served to push the agenda narrative through their own communities as well due to their large following. Agendas, however, aren't really unique to any of these creators or the One Piece community in general for that matter, but the vastness of agendas in this community far outclasses any other anime or manga's version of agenda scaling and discourse. Agenda Piece is something that largely formed due to the vastness of One Piece's world building and how alive the world feels as a story, with the main characters and antagonists not being the only important characters, leading to a greater spread of figures to root for. With things like flashbacks, newspapers, and bounties being so integral to the narrative of One Piece, Agenda Piece is something that would have inevitably formed regardless of any of these individual creators as the story got larger and larger in terms of the amount of characters that are relevant, but with the growth of these channels allowing them to reach such a wide audience, coinciding with the final saga of One Piece starting up, as well as the growth of so many characters outside Luffy and the Straw Hats, the Agenda Piece community had the perfect concoction to boom much larger in recent history than it would have in the past. I spoke previously about the rise of animation quality during Wano playing an important role in the great age of Agenda Piece, and I want to go a little bit deeper into it now. With animation quality increasing so much in the recent arcs, the hype for One Piece saw an unprecedented boost. People that never heard about One Piece before or were ignoring it due to animation quality were suddenly seeing One Piece edits everywhere with top tier animation. My own first experience with One Piece was seeing Luffy get one shot by Kaido, and I'm not even joking to you when I tell you this. When I started reading the story myself years ago, I didn't even realize that what I had saw in that clip was from One Piece until I got to the chapter in Wano and remember that I had seen a clip about it way before. Animation quality directly affects the way people perceive certain things in a story because it simply feels more hype when things get good animation. It's one of the reasons why Zoro fans are so insufferable sometimes, because regardless of what's in the manga, they always receive insane glaze from Toei. The boost in animation, however, while serving for the growth of Agenda Piece and the One Piece fandom in general, has also had a detrimental effect on the perception of certain aspects of the story, which I'll go into further later on. With animation skyrocketing, so many other characters getting importance in the recent arcs, and One Piece YouTubers growing so quickly, Agenda Piece boomed astronomically during Wano, leading to the rise of that segment of the community, which is still going strong to this day. But Agenda Piece, while blooming from all of these factors, also boomed for one other key reason, which affects not just One Piece but all new gen anime in general, and that's the sportification of anime. Sportification in layman's terms is making something that isn't a sport like a sport, like betting on a cockfight or turning carnival games into a ranked event. The sportification of anime is something very recent that has happened largely due to the surge of popularity that most animes received in the West during lockdowns. With the rise of TikTok and the boost other social media platforms received, as well as the vast amount of free time that most of the world had during lockdown, anime essentially filled the role sports played in the lives of the people who consumed it, because ongoing series gave people something to hedge bets on. Not in a monetary sense where they were placing actual bets, but the feeling of being right about something being the reward you'd get, just like picking the right team to go to the finals in a certain sport. Agenda Piece is largely a byproduct of the sportification of anime. Most people will treat agendas like buying a certain stock. A character does well in the story, the character stock goes up. Character does bad in the story, stock goes down. The sportification of anime and its effect on Agenda Piece is why the Agenda Piece community community has now become the biggest segment of the One Piece community. Everyone has an agenda about something in the One Piece fandom. Even those who say they're not a part of the agenda piece community are still technically participating in it, because having a hope for something to happen in the story or having a character that you root for outside of Luffy is in itself having an agenda. If you're willing to defend your stance on anything, that's also having an agenda too. The reason I don't include Luffy when talking about having an agenda is because rooting for Luffy isn't really having an agenda in the first place. It's just reading One Piece. There is no real Luffy agenda, because regardless of to what degree you root for Luffy, you understand that he's going to do well no matter what because he's the main character. Luffy's stocks are essentially at a fixed rate because they will never crash unless Oda himself switches who the MC is, which, let's be honest, that's never gonna happen. So with the sportification of anime being one of the leading causes for agenda piece, we must also talk about a byproduct of said sportification, which is the rise of the power scaling community. Most One Piece creators nowadays are essentially pseudo sports commentators on the series. There isn't a single creator on this platform or any other platform that has not made a why X can beat Y video or making a statement on a popular debate in the community. Power scaling has now become a massive part of the One Piece community, and it has led to a rise of the more toxic side of the agenda piece section of the fandom. One of the reasons why casual readers hate agenda piece is because they hate the way people will interpret/misinterpret the story for the sake of fulfilling their own agendas and acting as though that their way is the only correct way. I myself am guilty of it as well, but I don't really care though. One Piece scaling is something that fuels the fire of agenda piece even more than in any other community, because the scaling for One Piece is so incredibly fluid and variable. Unlike most shows where the power is fixed and it's obvious to tell who is stronger than who, Oda leans more into the rock paper scissors approach of organizing the characters' strength brackets. One Piece is a story that doesn't have very many direct strength scaling methods that are canon to the story, so most of it is just left up to personal interpretation and community consensus. Since interpretation is highly personal, it leads to many debates and arguments in the community on which interpretation is closest to Oda's. Power scaling in the One Piece community is typically looked down on by the members of other anime communities because the scaling can feel so inconsistent at times. While One Piece scaling can be inconsistent sometimes, it's not more inconsistent than any other scaling is in any other community. One Piece scaling differs in the fact that beating one character doesn't necessarily mean you're stronger than another, and statements are not the end-all be-all. Narrative and portrayal are much more integral to the power scaling in the story, being second only to actual feats, and in some cases even superseding feats at certain times. Like I said in my Characters Who Can Beat Kaido video, I will be going over the words narrative and portrayal, as well as the reading comprehension of the One Piece community and how agenda piece has had both a negative and positive effect on it. Portrayal means the depiction of someone or something in a work of art or literature. Essentially, it's what the author is trying to show you. Narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events. When used in reference to a story, it essentially means what the author is trying to show you using the words in the story. For example, character statements, speech patterns, or narrator statements. These two things have both been the bane and the savior of the agenda piece community. With power scaling in One Piece being so contested, people will try and use anything they possibly can to prove their point, and will often end up going to statements and portrayal as a tiebreaker if the debate is going on for a while. The issue with this, however, is that narrative and portrayal are even more complicated to use in scaling than just straight feats, because then it becomes a semantics argument on whose interpretation of the story is better and why their own interpretation is closer to what Oda is saying. This leads to those who will either disingenuously misinterpret feats being brought against their argument for the sake of their side winning, just misunderstanding the narrative and portrayal completely due to a lack of reading comprehension, or ignoring the narrative and portrayal completely due to not wanting to argue based on it. Agenda piece itself hasn't ruined reading comprehension, but its rise has had an effect on the deterioration of the integrity that those two things once held in the community. It's becoming more and more common where people will not take anything as a possibility unless it's literally said to them verbatim in the words they feel are easiest to understand. Like for instance, Kizaru not trying on Egghead. It's very clear that Kizaru was not going all out, and it's portrayed and implied in the narrative on numerous occasions. But since it was never said verbatim that he wasn't going all out, a certain segment of the agenda piece community will not accept the portrayal that's been given. This goes back the other way as well, when people will try to misinterpret the portrayal and try to use it to supersede statements and feats that are just better. For example, people using Roger and Rox arguing in God Valley as a marker to say that Roger and Rox were equals, and that Roger and his rivals far surpassed Rox later on in life because of this. This is just not true, because the Rox being Roger's greatest foe statement would supersede that interpretation of the portrayal, as the statement was made with all of Roger's foes in mind, including the ones that are either stated to be equal to or stronger than he is. Agenda piece is a very fickle thing. It can either drive you mad if you place too much stake into it, and it can end up making you hate the community when you get too deep into it. There are many people in the community who wish agenda piece wasn't even a thing, with myself sometimes agreeing with that side of the community, but what I've come to realize, however, is that agenda piece is only as serious as you make it out to be. People like J. Cole and Brago and others love agenda piece because they don't argue for days and days with people who disagree with them simply because they disagree with them. Agenda piece is fun if you take a dip into it every once once in a while, but if you swim in it for hours, you're going to eventually feel sick of all the toxic chlorine in the agenda pool. The key to not hating agenda piece is simply to not take part in an agenda piece for too long for the sake of arguing. That's the key to any online discourse for that matter. People will have their own interpretations, people will think their own things. You can't hate someone for not believing the same thing you do, and you can't think that everyone who doesn't think the same way you do is a fool for it. There will be foolish people, sure. There will be those who you feel like hating, sure. But just like in the real world, when you come across those people, you don't press the argument for the sake of pressing the argument. You say what you feel needs to be said, and you move on. Now, in the context of agenda piece, this may upset those who want to draw an hour-long discussion out of you because they feel they can change your mind, but always remember, 99 times out of 100, you're not gonna change someone's mind over the internet. Anyone you feel whose mind you've changed was already considering the option you presented long before you even spoke to them. Reading comprehension, while being an issue in the agenda piece community, is not the main issue. The main issue with agenda piece is the main issue with all social media, and that's people taking it too deep or saying things they'd never say in real life. I find myself slipping into that side more and more, and for the sake of my own sanity, I'm just gonna have to keep it pushing because every video I make will just end up being a debate video at that rate, trying to disprove everyone I disagree with. I was actually contemplating making a true strength of Kizaru video instead of this one due to how much Kizaru downplay I was seeing from my last video, but that would have just led to a downward spiral of every video on this channel being Admirals vs Yonko, and that's not the only debate that's important to the One Piece community. I just want to say apologies to all the guys that I was arguing with over that Kaido future sight statement. While I do not budge at all on my statement that he does not have future sight unless he's drunk, I probably was going a bit crazy because, hey man, we get heated with agenda piece sometimes. Another thing I want to go over before the end of the video is, does Oda have his own agendas? I spoke about narrative and portrayal before, but does the person who's writing those narratives and portrayal have a bias towards certain characters? I think it's pretty clear, in my mind at least, that the only character that Oda has any real bias towards is Shanks, and Oda will still give other characters statements and portrayal to get them over Shanks as far as the agenda side is concerned. Oda's an author that doesn't have a clear bias towards any one character, which is why out of any community, agenda piece is the most diverse as far as discussions go. In Dragon Ball, it's only Goku vs Vegeta with a little bit of Beerus or Frieza sprinkled in. Jujutsu Kaisen, it's only Gojo and Sukuna with maybe Yuji and Yuta being sprinkled in, and with other shonen, it's literally just the main character versus who the main villain might be. Agenda piece is the most diverse because One Piece is the most diverse. It's the only one where a character like Moria and a character like Odin could take control of the discussion in the community for multiple days and have every creator put some sort of statement out concerning it. The fact Oda doesn't have a clear bias towards any group of characters is why agenda piece is so great. It's also great for the fact that every character still has a shot of coming back. I know people hate the fact that Oda doesn't kill more characters, but like, be for real, man. These are characters in a story. Their death doesn't really mean anything besides, oh damn, we'll never see them again. Besides their deaths making a radical change to a certain character's portrayal and actions in the story, deaths in shonen don't really matter beyond wanting to see someone die. Characters having a shot of always returning unless they're stated to have died is why people will still hold out hope for Kid-in-Law or Kaido and Big Mom and defend their agenda so hard. If Kaido or Kid were confirmed to be dead, I guarantee you most of the people wouldn't go as hard on them as they do right now. If Doflamingo wasn't alive and impelled down with the possibility of returning, no one would speak about him after Dressrosa. The fact that your agendas can actually come true in the story is what makes them so easy to have hour-long debates about or discuss for days and days with your friends about. I made this video because agenda piece is something that has to be analyzed. There's nothing like it in any other anime community, and it's one of the reasons why One Piece is the most popular anime manga series by far. A story like One Piece will never be made again, and no other community in manga will ever reach the fever pitch that agenda piece has reached. If you ever feel like leaving the community because of agenda piece and never coming back, take it from someone who had access to the One Piece community and lost it for years. It always feels better to argue with someone about something you love than it is to have absolutely no one to share it with. If you stuck around to the end of the video, let me know what you think. Is agenda piece negative or positive for the One Piece community? Is it something that has changed the way you consume One Piece, and does it have an impact on the reading comprehension of the fan base? As always, if you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more high quality One Piece content. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.